Welcome to another episode of the Boris Tip of the Week. In today's episode, we're talking about how to make your title giver's job just a little bit easier. When you go to ask for a title and you go with the standard sharing to Kingdom chat here, there is an 8-second delay or so before you can type, meaning you can't tell them what title you want right away. So this can delay title giving, and here's a way to quickly get around that. First, what we're going to do is we're going to click our city and go to the little purple flag marker. If you go down to the star, you can use any of these three markers and then put your name and what title you want. So in this case, I'm asking for the Duke title, so I'm putting it down under the blue star. I could always put Architect under green or Scientist under red. But then when I go to the little star at the top of the screen, it's right here. So when I share this to Kingdom Chat, it says my name and the title I want. So this saves on the chat delay and will make your title givers a lot more easily able to give you titles and to get to the next person and help them. Welcome to another episode of the Boris Tip of the Week. In this episode, we're covering what makes the ring and the horn such standard options for accessories. Overall, these are the gold standard for accessories, and there's a pretty good reason why. So first, the horn gives you an extra 50 rage on a 30% chance with no real cap. And the thing to remember there is rage works for smite commanders, true damage commanders, skill damage commanders. More skill uses is terrific, so it works for pretty much everybody. So that's something to keep in mind. Next, the ring gives a 10% chance to boost all damage, not skill damage, not smite damage. So because of that, it matches up with every commander just like the horn does. So the two of these together create two of the strongest buffs that work for all commanders, which makes them great generalist options. And while you do have some other options that work really great, like Vengeance or Greatest Glory, these tend to be the gold standard for accessories. Welcome to another episode of the Boris Tip of the Week. In this episode, we're covering what makes a commander have greater longevity than another. There are three main factors that tend to contribute to commander longevity. The first thing is a unique mechanic. Think about Joan's ability to recast her skill, or William's ability to buff rage gain, or Hera's ability to shield and reduce normal damage. If they have a unique kit piece that is not really replaceable or hasn't been replaced, they tend to have much longer longevity. Next, buffs and debuffs that scale are a huge boost. Whether you're talking about the skill damage buff on Nevsky that's made him a mainstay for years, literally, or any sort of buff or debuff that you may see, especially in the field, it's major. And last but certainly not least, having solid stat blocks and consistent kit synchronicity that synchronize well with other commanders. Because if you can keep synchronizing as the meta changes, you'll keep them in the meta. Welcome to another episode of the Boris Tip of the Week. In today's episode, we are talking about why Mightiest Governor events tend to be fixed by leadership. Mightiest Governor events are one of the easiest ways to pick up nearly 200 sculptures for one specific player in your kingdom. However, it may seem frustrating that leadership tends to fix these events, but there are good reasons for that. First is that overall, the Mightiest Governor commanders are heavily skewed to be rallies and garrisons, meaning that the kingdom leadership in general needs those commanders on their best players to be able to do best in those two facets of the game to actually succeed in KvKs. So that's something that's important to remember, and being able to have those higher ranks for those players means that they spend less and are able to keep most of those reserves ready for actual fighting. The second thing to remember is that it actually boosts the overall kingdom effectiveness because you have more coverage and the heads tend to be spread out between multiple players. Here are the best hollow square formation commanders. First is Hera. Hera is the hollow square commander because this whole kit is based around multiple shields, which is what hollow square needs to be truly effective, and he uses it very well. While he can use arch formation or wedge formation depending on what his primary is, if you're using to maximize his ability, hollow square is the way to go. Next, we have Gorgo. While Gorgo is the flagship arch formation commander, she can get some extra value out of hollow square, so it is something to consider because she does have a small shield. But overall, you're probably going to be using her as arch more often than not. And last, but certainly not least, you have Martel or Scipio Pride. Both have good shields, and you can use Alexander here as well. And it really depends on who you're pairing them with, and when you put them together with another shielding commander, that's when you're really going to want to be using hollow square. This is what each troop type does uniquely better than any other troop type. Note that this is a spin-off of a What Troop Type You Should Main video, and I'll provide a link for that in the description. First, for cavalry, mobility is the key feature they have. Almost every commander either has a support tree or the mobility tree that gives great movement speed in their kit, and it really is the key part that makes cavalry special. Next, for archers, is damage output, whether it's single target with Boudica or AoE with Herman, Liang, YSG. Archers tend to have some of the strongest damage outputs. And while the mobility of cavalry may be a little traumatizing to them, the damage output is more than worthwhile. And last, but certainly not least, for infantry, the key factor is tankiness. They tend to have the highest survivability, and they tend to resist damage better than any other troop type, both naturally and within their kits. Something interesting I wanted to tackle when we're talking about these new commanders is how attack affects their ability to do damage. Attack will affect their normal damage and counterattack damage as they do with all commanders. What's interesting is on the active skill itself, the true damage percentage is actually impacted by attack. So instead of the damage being affected by attack is based on the amount you can heal, the percentage of that factor is instead translated to damage. So that's kind of something that's interesting to consider. So if it scales about the same as skill and normal damage does, it won't be a huge deal. You probably won't even notice the difference. But if it scales at a higher rate, it might be something that you need to consider in the future because it could be something that affects the damage. Of course, like all things, it's going to be tested heavily, and once we start to get a good idea, we'll be able to know whether or not attack is truly impactful as much as it is on other commanders. Here's why, if you're using your farm as a filler, you don't necessarily have to upgrade past T4 and go to T5. When it comes to farms, a lot of players love to use them as fills, and it's a great option because you save a lot of the losses on your main account for the more heavy fights, especially in the early zones. And you're able to help contribute and pull your weight with that additional matchmaking rating that farm creates. But here's why, if you're going to use it as a filler, you might want to keep it at T4. When it comes to the trade, the lead of the garrison and the lead of the rally really does the majority of the quality of trade. Making sure that you have the right troop bill is impactful, and making sure they're filled timely is impactful as well. While troop quality does impact to some extent, if you're trying to use it for value, the T4 to T5 difference isn't as huge of a deal. And when you're looking at it overall, the additional tech is just creating additional matchmaking rating and additional contribution. So if you stay at T4, I recommend doing that for your farms. When it comes to resisting swarm, normal and counterattack damage does more for you, especially at high levels when you're being swarmed by 20 or more marches. But why is that? Today we're going to be talking about it. When it comes to AoEs, AoEs do great against 1 march, 2 march, maybe even 3 marches. However, as you get to successive marches, your AoE does reduce damage down to 50% possibly. Add on the fact that you are only able to hit up to 5 targets, and you get an AoE that can only hit 5 of the possibly 20 plus swarmers. Alternatively, normal and counterattack damage deal more damage on the basic attacks. So while the scale isn't as large as a skill damage effect, you will deal more damage to everybody who's hitting you because you're dealing more in the counterattack damage and normal damage. So as the swarmers get heavier and heavier, counterattack damage and normal damage become more and more impactful. When it comes to rallies and garrisons, there is something that tends to hold players up and make them hesitate, and that's troop loss. There's a lot of hesitation about expending troops and losing them as dead troops in a KvK. I kind of wanted to dispel some of that, because ultimately, you should see your troops as a resource. So just like your food or your gold that you use to heal troops, your troops themselves are a resource. So as a defense, you expend them to actually keep a defensive position, while when you are attacking with a rally, you are expending them to overwhelm that position. So you're spending them to gain or save territory. And you're essentially expending them for time as defense and to burn up an enemy's time on offense. So don't be afraid to lose those troops either as a filler or a lead because they're just a resource just like everything else. Here are the top 3 garrison pairs right now. These are based on how I feel they perform as well as how well they cover multiple situations. First, by a pretty significant margin, is Gorgo Hera. Gorgo just has so much in her kit that resists damage, and so much that she can do on her own. And the fact that she can run with Hera relatively easily is huge. So she definitely gets the nod as the best overall option. In second place, we have CY Hera. This is a great kit, and while CY isn't a perfect match for Hera, they definitely do well together. Between the true damage output, the shield, the AoE, and the increased counterattack damage, there's just a lot to be excited about. And in third place, we have Eleanor Hera. While this is the most accepting of mixed units, it's also one of the weaker ones just because it's the older commander out of the groups, and it isn't as loaded as Gorgo. Here are the top current infantry garrisons in Rise of Kingdoms. With the main video I've released, I'll include the link in the description, but I wanted to also briefly cover this for those who want to have a more quick resource. So first, Gorgo is the main centerpiece, and she is part of every one of the main pairings. The best pairing for Gorgo is Hera, so Gorgo Hera is naturally the best pairing for infantry overall. Alternatively, there are a lot of options that involve using Constantine or Zenobia, but those need to be infantry only, while Hera needs to have at least 3 different troop types, and I recommend doing 70% infantry, 15% cavalry, and 15% archers. But an alternative that you do go infantry only, Zeno and Constantine are the 2 most popular, and both are very solid because of Hold the Line. But overall, Gorgo Hera is going to get you the best results, and you don't have to stress as much about the troop type composition in the process. Here are the top cavalry garrisons in Rise of Kingdoms. This is the shorts version of the long format video that will be posted in the description if you want to check that out. But first and foremost, Eleanor Hera is the best cavalry garrison right now, because Eleanor takes mixed units very well. She pairs extremely well with Hera, so it makes a great option, and it's the best overall for cavalry. Alternatively, if you're looking for a more cavalry heavy option, Eleanor Jan is another option as well, where you have a lot more cavalry specific buffs, although not having full cavalry does not sink this garrison, which is a huge plus, especially for lower seeded kingdoms, or kingdoms who have trouble keeping garrisons perfectly reinforced. And last but certainly not least is Jan Hera. While it's not as good as Eleanor Hera, it's a good option, especially for those who are just getting back into the game and restarting garrisons that already have Jan available. These are the best archer garrisons in Rise of Kingdoms. Note that this is the shorter version of the long format video, and if you want to check out more detailed information, I will provide a link in the description. First, CY Hera is the archer garrison right now. CY does great damage on his own with his true damage, and Hera isn't necessarily tied to any one damage type because most of his truly great part of his kit is the shield and the normal damage reduction. So they make an ideal pair, even though there's some parts of CY that needs to be all archers, while Hera needs to have at least 3 unit types. I recommend 70, 15, 15 if you're going to run CY Hera with archers, cavalry, and infantry respectively. Next, of course, is CY Dido. That is a more archer-only option because if you can keep all archers, you then get more normal damage reduction. But that is entirely up to you because it's a little more risky. But overall, I say I prefer CY Hera overall and then CY Dido.